You know, 20 years ago, for about a year and a half, I lived here. And it was a time between two really hard projects. In fact, it was following one really hard project. Some of you know that the production company I'm a member of, Homeland's Production, was based here in Gloucester for a while. And we were all pretty exhausted after having traveled around the Americas doing a huge series for National Public Radio. And coming here turned out to be just a wonderful, wonderful home. And it became a place that allowed me to really reflect on everything that we had just done and think about what comes next. And what came next turns out to be everything else that I've written ever since. But Gloucester is so much a part of my formation as a journalist, and I'm truly grateful. I mean, it's also a formation, part of my formation as a writer. I mean, going back to the first time I ever read Charles Olson, it's such a thrill to be here, and my gratitude to the Gloucester Writers Center at Cape Ann Forum for what you are doing here. So, what am I doing here tonight? Well, for those of you who don't know my last book, The World Without Us, let me just say that I actually wrote it because I want a world with us. It was a thought experiment that theoretically wiped us off the map in order to show how quickly the Earth could heal and refill empty niches when relieved of the daily pressures that we heap on it. And my hope was that once readers saw this picture of a newly restored, healthy planet, they'd be inspired to wonder if there might not just be a way to add ourselves back into the picture, only in harmony, not in constant combat with the rest of nature. But in trying to determine exactly what that nice natural balance might be, I ran into a troubling fact that every 4.5 days or less, we add 1 million more people to the planet. And that did not sound very sustainable. So at the end of The World Without Us, I tried another little thought experiment. I asked one of the world's most distinguished demographic institutes, it's in Vienna, to compute, setting all social implications aside, what would happen if we all participated in China's one-child policy? Well, the surprising answer was that by the end of this century, our population would be back to about 1.6 billion, which was exactly the population of the Earth at the beginning of the 20th century, before suddenly we doubled our numbers and then doubled again, all in the space of 1 century. Now, 1.6 billion would give us and other species a lot of breathing room. But look, let's be serious. None of us wants some government telling us what to do. Nevertheless, China's one-child policy, which was implemented in 1980, may be why there are 400 million fewer Chinese today than there might have been otherwise. But realistically, a policy like that is unacceptable to anyone else. And then there's the question of whether it even matters that every year that we add all those people, which is the equivalent of 4 Beijings or 10 more New York cities. There was an op-ed earlier this fall in the New York Times that argued that the more people there are, the more human ingenuity will have to solve problems, like how to feed more of us. Now, although that may sound like circular or magical thinking, many pro-growth economists argue that we can have our planet and eat it too. But that question that I left dangling at the end of The World Without Us, namely, what is the sustainable carrying capacity of this planet for our species, factoring in our consumptive habits? That became one of the main things that readers want to discuss. But it is a topic loaded with conflicts, and most environmental groups don't dare touch it. and yet nothing affects the environment more than us. Now, as one woman describes in this book, the population question is where natural science and social science intersect. Actually, it's really where they collide. It's easy to grasp. Think of it this way. It's easy to grasp that in a national park, balance must be maintained between predators and prey, lest the ecosystem crash. But when it's our own species, it gets a lot harder. So I decided that I should examine this, and not as an advocate or a foe of population management. I could have said more precisely population control, but even that's a loaded statement, a loaded phrase now. But examine it as a journalist, researching and weighing the facts from as many kinds of sources as possible. Now, if this book seems thick, it's because most of the last 100 pages are my bibliography and index in very small type. But besides that truckload of books that Nubar was talking about, I also traveled to 21 countries in order to find not just the facts, but evocative stories to try to make this a compelling read. Now, about those facts. Look, I do not pull any punches in Countdown. We are facing some very serious challenges in this century, and much of it likely may be a wild ride through uncharted territory. The number of humans on this planet is far more than nature ever intended. And our demands are now changing the atmosphere and the chemistry of the oceans and our soils in some dangerous ways. I mean, for one, there hasn't been this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 3 million years, back when the seas were 80 to 100 feet higher. Nevertheless, I came out of researching this book far more encouraged than when I went into it, because I found something easily affordable that we can actually do that can make a huge difference, and there's already a lot of momentum and precedence for it in nearly every part of the world. And it also affords an unprecedented opportunity for social justice. My research for Countdown came out of 4 questions. 1, how many people can fit on this planet without tipping it over? Number 2, how much nature must we preserve to ensure our own survival? Or can we possibly know which other species are essential to us before we wipe out any more? 3, if the Chinese policy is mostly unacceptable to people, is there anything in the histories, the holy books, or the current circumstances of the broad swath of the rest of our world's cultures, religions, nationalities, etc., that might embrace the idea of, so to speak, refraining from embracing so much in a time of crisis? And to answer that one is another reason why I had to travel to 21 countries. 4, if the safe number is less than the nearly 11 billion we're currently headed to by the century's end, or even less than the 7.2 billion that we're already at, is there a way to design an economy that doesn't depend on perpetual growth to prosper, so that we might gradually bring our numbers back to a healthy level and keep them there? Now, more than one expert I interviewed remarked that those may be the most important questions on Earth, but they may be impossible to answer. And my reply was, hey, if such questions are the most important on Earth, we damn well better try. But as I said, they are loaded. And that's especially true when there are political and religious pressures to be fruitful and multiply, to build a mighty tribe or nation. I start Countdown in one of the hottest examples, Israel and Palestine, where extremes of both are bent on outpopulating each other in a land much of which is a sandbox. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews having double-digit families in hopes of becoming the majority of the land, versus what was once called Yasser Arafat's biology bomb. The Palestinian Liberation Organization's secret weapon, he used to say, was the Palestinian womb. And I began there because to Christian, Jew, and Muslim alike, this is hallowed ground. It's a place that evokes powerful emotions in most humans on this planet. Now, before the State of Israel was created in 1947, British ecologists calculated the carrying capacity of the Holy Land to be 3.5 million people. Founding Zionist and first Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, however, argued that Jewish ingenuity could make the desert bloom. So he believed the land could hold nearly twice that, 6 million. Well, today, there are nearly 12 million jammed between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And by the middle of this century, there will be 21 million, and a lot less water. Desalinization plants are already running nonstop, and they are very energy intensive, and they produce more kosher sea salt than Israel can sell. and you don't want to dump that all back into the sea, lest you disrupt marine ecology. Excuse me. It's either me or the lamp, looks like. Okay. Better? Good. Okay. So, oh, did that screw up your film? Okay. Okay, good. I met Israeli and Palestinian ecologists, water experts, and demographers who were frightened about growing numbers. Both a rabbi and a Quranic scholar cited the story of Noah, whom God told that in order to save the human race, he also had to save all the animals. We can't have a world without them. But I also met the ultra-devout on all sides who believe it's God's will to have more children and that God will provide for everyone. Ecologists sometimes talk about what they call the Netherlands Fallacy, namely the fact that so many Dutch who live in Europe's most densely populated country, the fact that they have such a high standard of living is not proof that humans can thrive in essentially an unnatural, artificial environment. And yet I heard that argued in Israel. One ecologist called it technological optimism, the idea that they can solve anything if they put their minds to it. Like all of us, though, both the Dutch and the Israelis need things that only an ecosystem can provide, and they must purchase most of those things from somewhere else. The northern half of the Holy Land, where most Israelis live, by the way, is already nearly twice as densely packed as the Netherlands. Now, another ecologist who was also a Talmudic scholar cited the story of Joseph, born at a time when Israelites were polygamists, for the same reasons the Mormons were later. It was a strategy to have many children so the tribe would grow quickly. But then Joseph, who was possibly our first ecologist in recorded history, astutely observed that a time of scarcity was imminent. One of 13 children himself, he confined himself to just one wife and 2 sons, and he advised Egypt's Pharaoh and the Israelites that it was time for everyone to conserve in order to save themselves. And I have a modern example later in the book. Among the countries I visited that have discovered non-coercive, completely voluntary ways of bringing their population down is one that surprises a lot of people in this country because it's a Muslim theocracy. The same year as its 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran actually applied coercion the opposite direction, charging every fertile female to do her patriotic duty and get pregnant to help build a 20 million man army to fight off the invading Iraqis. Now, by some estimates, at one point, Iran's growth rate peaked near the biological limits for fertile women and had the highest population rate of increase that the world had ever seen. Now, you might recall that Saddam Hussein invaded Iran hoping that he could easily seize an oil-rich province on their border because the new Islamic Republic was just barely getting organized. And also that NATO supplied much of his armaments, including feedstock for nerve gas. Iran, without much sophisticated weapons technology, simply responded with repeated waves of soldiers, enough to hold Iraq at bay for 8 years. Today, wherever you go there, you see billboards filled with rows of pictures of locals who were among the 1 million Iranians martyred in that war. But once it was finally over, truce was declared, the director of Iran's Planning and Budget Office, an economist, realized that they had big problems. All those males born to man the 20 million man army would eventually grow up and need jobs, and the chances for providing them shrank with each new birth. So he and others met with the supreme leader to warn of the instability of a nation filled with frustrated, angry, under or unemployed young men. In short, a nation like today's Pakistan, where I also went. So soon thereafter, the country that had told its females to all get pregnant for the good of the nation was posting banners across the road reading, "1 is good, 2 is enough." A new Ayatollah, he's still in power today, issued a fatwa stating that when wisdom dictates that you do not need more children, a vasectomy is permissible. A female OBGYN in Tehran, a devout Muslim woman, told me what it was like being on teams of doctors that went on horseback to health clinics to the remotest villages, and later by four-wheel drive and even helicopters, offering everything from condoms and pills to tubal ligations, all for free. But it was also all voluntary. Everybody could choose the number of children they wanted. The only obligation was to attend premarital counseling. It's not a bad idea for anybody, by the way, either in a mosque or in a health center. Among the things discussed in those classes was how much it costs to feed, care for, and educate children. Now, the other crucial part of Iran's family planning program was encouraging women to stay in school, because girls tend to postpone their childbearing until they complete their education. In fact, everywhere I went, rich country, poor country, female education turns out to be the most effective contraceptive of all. Because once she's out of school, a woman has something new and useful and interesting to do with her life and the skills to make a living for her family. But it's hard to do that with many children. So the great majority of educated women in the world tend to have 2 children or fewer. In Iran, where today 60% of university students are female, population growth came down to replacement rate, meaning 2 parents produce an average of 2 children to replace themselves, a year faster than China. Now, some of you probably know that not long ago, in fact, while I was there, the Ayatollah suddenly reversed this policy after 20 years. The night that that happened, I was with the oldest environmental group in Iran, which was actually a women's group. It was founded by a librarian at the University of Tehran who started telling women, you know, all the advertising is directed at us. We're the biggest consumers. We need to do something about this. And these women were livid and were plotting to protest even as I left. So we're hoping that with the new president in Iran that the policy will turn around again. Population only increases in 2 ways. More people are born than die, or people live longer, so they're still around when others are born. Now, for much of human history, sadly enough, most babies were dead by their 5th birthday. You can imagine the pain of our ancestors. The fact that population grew so slowly until only about 2 centuries ago means that although a woman might have 7 or 8 kids, the average number of children who survived long enough to have kids themselves was barely more than 2. And our average life expectancy was about 40 years. But then, in 1798, Edward Jenner discovered a vaccine for smallpox, which used to knock back our numbers by the millions. And that was followed by more vaccines for more diseases, and then antiseptics, eradication of insects that carried epidemics, pasteurization of milk, and suddenly fewer were dying young and people were living longer. Now, none of us over 40 would ever argue that medical technology is a bad thing, because without it, most of us would not be here. But it's important to understand, though, that whenever we cure another disease, more people stay alive to beget more people. For years, Bill and Melinda Gates, like many others, have dedicated much time and money to eradicate diseases such as malaria and HIV. But in recent years, they've come to realize that solving one problem would exacerbate another on a stressed and stretched planet. So they're now major funders of family planning, because when there's too many of us, it's increasingly more complicated to keep ourselves and human civilization healthy. But an even more significant boost to our numbers than modern medical technology came from modern food technology. Just before World War I, 2 Germans, a chemist named Fritz Haber and engineer Karl Bosch, invented something that changed the world arguably more than anything else ever in human history. And that was a way to pull nitrogen from the air and apply it chemically to soils. Before the Haber-Bosch process, the amount of plant life on the planet was limited to what a relatively few species that hosted nitrogen-fixing bacteria could contribute to the soil. Artificial nitrogen fertilizer, though, simply blew the lid off of what nature could do. Let me put it this way, more than 40% of us wouldn't be here without it. You take away artificial fertilizer, our population would be little more than half of what it is today. So small wonder that both of those men won Nobel Prizes. Now, to a certain extent, Fritz Haber mitigated the population spurt he unleashed by also inventing the mustard gas that Germany used in World War I. And a cyanide-based pesticide fumigant he created to use in grain storage was later refined by the Nazis into Zyklon B, which was used in extermination camps and made in a factory that Karl Bosch headed. Now, both of those scientists were fervent anti-Nazis, but they lost control of their creations. And some would argue that that not only applies to nerve gas, but also to nitrogen fertilizer, which has downsides that we all now well know. Force feeding our crops with chemicals sterilizes soils, fouls downstream waters, kills off chunks of the ocean the size of New Jersey at the mouths of the world's rivers, and it emits a lot of nitrous oxide, which is the most potent greenhouse gas after CO2 and methane. And the stuff is made from fossil fuels. I mean, essentially, we're eating oil. Now, in a 2009 encyclical, Pope Benedict XVI wrote, "On this earth there is room for everyone through hard work and creativity." So while researching this book, I visited the Vatican. I was intrigued to know whether this Pope, who some of you may know, was called the Green Pope because he put solar panels on St. Peter's and really spoke a lot about the environmental crisis of the world. But I was wondering if, when he said for everyone, that he and the church meant not just us or other species too. And also, there was the fact that the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences, to the previous Pope's dismay, had warned in 1994 that it was now unthinkable to sustain indefinitely a birth rate beyond 2 children per couple. The consequences, they said, would be unsustainable to the point of absurdity. Nevertheless, the church still encourages population growth. So where, I asked the Academy's current director, will we get food for nearly 10 billion people by mid-century when already we have more than we have between 1 and 2 billion hungry people on the planet? Wouldn't clearing more forests for farming be disastrous? I mean, at one point in this book, I'm touring China with scientists from the National Academy of Sciences there, and they showed me how, plagued by floods and erosion, China alone is spending $40 billion to put trees back. It's the biggest and most expensive environmental mitigation project on the planet. Well, the answer, I was told in the Pontifical Academy, was new transgenic crops that are being designed at the centers of the Green Revolution. Those are the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, which is in Mexico, and the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. Now, as most of you know, in the 1960s, just as a burgeoning population in the developing world was nearing the brink of famine, a miracle of genetic breeding occurred in those centers that more than doubled the world's grain harvests, and in some cases increased yields tenfold. And Green Revolution food technologies are often touted for debunking the dire predictions of inevitable famine as population growth outpaces food production, made by economist Thomas Robert Malthus back at the end of the 18th century, before there was even 1 billion people on the planet, and his latter-day analogs, 2 American ecologists, Paul and Ann Ehrlich, who wrote the 1968 book, The Population Bomb. But when I went to both of those Green Revolution centers, I met no food scientists who agreed that they'd been debunked. Actually, they said, when Green Revolution founder Norman Borlaug won the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize, in his acceptance speech, he warned that there can be no permanent progress in the battle against hunger until agencies that fight for increased food production and those who fight for population control unite in a common effort. Now, Borlaug, who's credited for saving more lives than anyone in history, understood the paradox of food. The more we produce, the more people don't die of starvation, and they live to beget more people who need to be fed. Until his death, he served on the board of population groups because he knew that food production can't keep up with the very population growth it helps to produce. So as a result, we have all these hungry people. And despite everyone's best efforts, it's likely to get worse. The first two places where the Green Revolution was tried were India and Pakistan, and both were saved from what seemed like certain famine. But as a result, in about a decade, India will surpass China as the most populous nation on earth. And Pakistan's one of the fastest growing, and frankly, it's one of the scariest places on earth. Pakistan today has more than 185 million people in a country not much bigger than Texas, which has 26 million. And by mid-century, if its growth continues apace, Pakistan will far outnumber today's United States with nearly 400 million people, and it'll still be the size of Texas. And a significant number of them are frustrated, angry, and unemployed young men. Every day I was there, mayhem erupted, including several urban grenade battles. I lost one interview with two men who had been saving Karachi's mangrove forests because the previous day they were found floating in the lagoon, tortured and murdered by the local timber mafia. At Karachi's civil hospital, whose entrance is also a police station, armed guards are posted on every floor lest warfare break out. Pakistan's waxing out of control, and it happens to be a nuclear power. In India, the head of the Punjab State Farm Commission, who directed the implementation of India's Green Revolution back in the 60s, told me that India's three biggest problems are population, and you know the rest. Three farmers who I met in his office took me to their villages, where I spent a day mostly interviewing widows of farmers, widows who'd killed themselves because levels in the 50-foot wells originally dug to water Green Revolution crops had now dropped to 500 and even to 1,000 feet and beyond, and they couldn't afford to keep drilling. And according to figures from their farm union, which I corroborated with the Indian government, 270,000 Green Revolution Indian farmers have committed suicide since 1995. Overwhelmingly, the symbolic method of choice is by drinking pesticide. Half our people are sick from pesticides, heart attacks, high blood pressure, cancer, the farmers told me. Our kids have skin diseases and bad eyesight. No matter how much they eat, they're anemic. The teachers call them slow learners, and their fathers, all 200,000 rupees in debt on every acre, all suicides in waiting. We're all on each other's suicide watch. Well, today, more than half the human race lives not on farms, but in cities, compared to only a third of us back in 1950. Now, since kids in urban areas aren't an economic asset to parents like they are on farms, it's been widely assumed that world population would level off around 9.2 billion by mid-century. But even though we are growing more slowly, there are still so many of us that this past June, the UN's Population Division's latest revision projects that our numbers are going to keep growing, hitting nearly 11 billion by the end of the century, with no sure peak in sight yet. In the next 50 years, Norman Borlaug's successor at the wheat program told me, we'll need to produce as much food as has been consumed over our entire human history. And they were trying, he said. Geneticists there showed me what the Vatican was talking about. Experiments to accelerate photosynthesis, to hot rod it basically, to beat previous Green Revolution yields, and possibly even to give grains enough energy to fix their own nitrogen to minimize artificial fertilizer needs. But everyone said, even if they can do this, commercially viable enhanced photosynthesizing crops are at least 25 years away, and by then there'll be 2 billion more of us. And agro-engineers face one more growing problem spawned by growing populations. As ever more of us expel more carbon dioxide, our overloaded atmosphere overheats the planet, and for every 1 degree centigrade of warming, many scientists have written now that grain yields will drop 10%. So with our world now headed beyond a 2-degree centigrade increase at present emission rates, population will be up, food production down, irrigation water scarcer, and coastal dikes may have to protect much of the world's rice production, which has grown near sea level, which is probably unaffordable. And the rosy predictions that northern Canada and Siberia will be breadbaskets in a warmer world neglect the fact that their conifer-covered acidic soils will take millennia to adapt to the needs of crops. Now, since some of you may be wondering, at one point in my book, I do look at the prospects for a vegan dream test tube meat. But even artificial meat has to come from something, so currently there are experiments using things like blue-green algae, pig stem cells, and in Japan, human waste as feedstock. Yeah, ick. But just like jet-propelled photosynthesizers, the guess is that commercial viability is about 30 years off. So with 40% of the with 40% of the non-frozen Earth now dedicated to feeding ourselves, everywhere I went, I spent a lot of time researching that second crucial question: how much nature do we need to preserve to assure our own viability? How will we know if we push something off the planet that we didn't realize we needed until it was too late? And at the end, I'm going to read you a story about that. But for now, just a couple of examples. In Latin America, I saw some ecologists part of a worldwide effort called the Natural Capital Project. And they have shown now that we were in Costa Rica, where coffee yields from bushes adjacent to rainforest were 20% higher than plants a kilometer away, because birds, bats, native bees, and reptiles were pollinating and providing pest control. In Nepal, where overpopulation is not just a human but a bovine problem, as cows are sacred and can't be killed, I saw an ingenious project. It was an old cow's home that gave aging beasts a dignified final chapter rather than keep them working until they dropped with this arthritis ointment that had proved toxic to 8 endangered species of vultures. The World Wildlife Fund funded this project. Now the cows get a proper Hindu funeral, and their untainted carcasses feed the newly replenished, thriving vulture populations. In the Philippines, which are surrounded by the world's biologically richest seas, despite a national government that once bowed to the world's most conservative Catholic bishops, and please, any Catholics in this room, do not take offense. One of my greatest mentors in life was a Catholic priest, and he's also in the book, actually. But in the Philippines, I mean, they call them more Catholic than the Pope. There's this one Manila suburb that now sends men to prison for 6 months if they buy condoms without prescription. But in the Philippines, I saw fishing villages taking family planning into their own hands, because they've come to understand that if they want to keep fishing, which is the source of 90% of a Filipino's protein, they have to keep the number of fishermen in balance with fish stocks. And of course, we hope this is not too late because of the terrible typhoon that just recently creamed a lot of the villages that I went to along the coast of the Philippines. Across the water in Japan, the last wild oriental white stork had vanished in 1971. In 1989, a stork hatchery at Toyooka, which is an hour from Kyoto, successfully reproduced some using breeding pairs from Russia. But the local rice fields, which are soaked each year with organomercury pesticides, were too toxic for the fledgling birds to be released. So then in 2004, 15 years later, a 10-year-old schoolgirl heard that the storks, like the birds that were just caged in Toyooka's hatchery, had once filled the skies and nested on every chimney. And after learning why they no longer did, she went to the mayor and demanded that Toyooka serve organic rice for school lunches. Now, to do that would mean eliminating mercury, inviting back grasshoppers and other insects, but also making the rice paddies safe for storks. Now, the mayor, hearing the simple truth from a 10-year-old, could only agree. So his city slogan became, an environment good for storks must be good for humans too. The next plantings were pesticide-free. And a year later, the first stork was released, and today, wherever they nest, the rice is twice as valuable because the presence of storks guarantees its purity. An economy that once had bottomed out was rejuvenated, and today, tourists flock to Toyooka to watch hundreds of storks doing the same. Now, is this just a little story about a luxury food item, high-end organic rice? Actually not. This is a scenario that a Japanese economist named Akihiko Matsutani believes that Japan is headed to as one of the first countries on Earth whose population has begun to shrink. The reason is that 4 years after World War II, Japan had to cut off its baby boom. You may recall that it had started that war in the first place by invading Manchuria because its rapidly growing population needed more room. Then after the war, Japanese soldiers went home to their wives, same as ours, and Japan soon added another 10 million. But their economy was wrecked and people were starving. And pregnant women were literally throwing themselves in front of trains. So in 1949, in an emergency measure, Japan legalized abortion. Remember, this was before birth control pills. And millions of Japanese women partook, lest they watch more babies die of hunger. So today, as the aged last large generation dies off, there's a much smaller generation to replace them. And you add to that the high education level and the low fertility that naturally follows that, and just past the middle of this century, Japan is going to be nearly back to its 1945 population. And many Japanese economists are terrified by that. But Matsutani, who's no radical, but an economist at a major policy institute, sees it as opportunity. When I met him, Japan had just compounded its shrinkage by losing its most fertile fruit growing area, Fukushima, and all its nuclear power. Matsutani envisions a gradual realignment over the next few decades away from heavy exporting industries in big crowded port cities to a dispersed economy of lighter industries for domestic products and agriculture, distributed across a landscape that I watched younger people already starting to return to as the empty homes and land vacated by that last dying overgrown generation are becoming available for cheap. Lifestyles, he predicts, will actually improve. For one, wages won't drop because laborers will be fewer and more valuable. But working hours, as demand shrinks with population, will also be fewer. So prosperity will be redefined to mean having more leisure time to enjoy rather than being able to afford more consumer toys to occupy far too little downtime. And that's not a bad vision of a workable future, though many economists can't imagine it because to them the definition of economic health is growth. While I was there, I was asked by a well-known Japanese business magazine if I thought that people were being hysterical to demand an end to nuclear power in the wake of the Fukushima tragedy. I said, well, given that all your nuclear plants are in seismic zones or on seacoasts exposed to typhoons and tsunamis, I answered, I wouldn't call it hysteria. But people will suffer even more if productivity drops. Isn't it hysterical not to take that into account, he countered? And over the next half hour, he kept rephrasing his question, hoping for a more satisfying response, until during his fourth try, the room where we sat began to shake as a tremor struck central Tokyo, rendering my reply unnecessary. Now, the same magazine reports plans to rebuild all the fishing ports destroyed by the tsunami, even though Matsutani tries to tell them that it's going to take 20 years to do that, and by then only a quarter of the fishermen will still be around, so 3/4 of the port facilities won't be needed. But thus far, nobody seems to be thinking about anything beyond this year's contracts, not what their world will need in 20 years. Now, a late American economist, Julian Simon, who was known for preaching that human ingenuity ensured that resources would never run out, declared in 1994, we now have the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. Now, with world population at the time growing by 1.4% annually, Paul and Ann Ehrlich checked Simon's math and responded that this was unlikely because at those rates, within just 6,000 years, the mass of human population would equal the mass of the universe. It's true. But look, Simon is still cited widely today. Otherwise intelligent people want to believe such nonsense because humans have never had to think about limits before, and we're just not used to it. I mean, we were born at a time, when, here's was human population through most of history. And then it started to rise a little bit with medical technology, and then with food technology, the graph now looks like this. We were born here, so this looks normal to us. And we hear economists warning that if population ever stopped growing, there will be too few young laborers paying into the pension funds to support too many old people. Which is not exactly the truth, because there'll be, well, for one, economists, you have to remember, really like large populations because labor's cheaper. You got poor people fighting against each other for bad salaries. And they also neglect the fact that, unlike children, healthier senior citizens remain economically productive. But for a generation or so, until old and young come back into balance, we will have to adjust. And I know this would not be simple, but nothing in the 21st century is going to be. But we can do this gradually and acceptably. And frankly, I can think of a lot of things our country spends money on, such as those parties we threw in Iraq and Afghanistan, that could be better spent by helping to care for one generation of senior citizens until the numbers of old and young come to balance again. Look, here's the bottom line. If we keep on the way that we are going and growing, we will add 2.5 billion people in the next 35 years. Because we've already used up the best lands and the cheapest energy sources, they're going to have a much bigger and much dirtier impact than the last 2.5 billion. And yes, I know that population increase is mainly among the world's poor, and that the richest fifth of the world's people consume up to 66 times as much as the poorest fifth. I mean, if we multiply our numbers by the amount we consume, it turns out that this country where we're sitting is the most overpopulated one on Earth. But our numbers have now reached a point where we've essentially redefined the concept of original sin. Because even the humblest among us compound the world's mounting problems by needing food and firewood and shelter. The world's masses may be poor, but more of them now live in cities. And I go to some of the poorest ones in the world in this book, and somehow they manage to get a hold of cell phones. And whether they're pirating the power or not, they're plugging in their chargers every night, just like you and me. So the reason that I wrote this book was not to ask if we can support the 11 billion we're headed to, but whether we're already too many. Because every species in the history of biology that exceeds the limit of its resource base suffers a population crash. I sincerely doubt we're going to make it to 11 billion. One way or another, our population's coming down. But either we'll manage it gracefully, or nature will do it to us. And it won't be so pretty. But here is the good news. Because we can fix this and give relief to our precious environment, without which we cannot live. We can do it for less money each year than our government was spending in a month in Afghanistan and Iraq. That amount, about $8.1 billion annually, would let us provide contraception for everyone on Earth who wants it. And in this book, I accompany the people who make contraceptives available in places like Uganda and Thailand and Mexico, where women want and need them, and also the people who pay for them. And I was staggered to learn how few the donors are, mainly a few Western governments and 4 private foundations, and also how fragile the supply lines are. If a shipment of contraceptive injections doesn't arrive, or the truck carrying birth control pills breaks down, or they disappear from the warehouse, as you women well know, you miss one crucial dose and all those careful efforts are lost. The United States, I'm pleased to say, is the biggest donor of all. But understand, I am not a member of a political party. But had someone else won the last presidential election, President Obama's opponents promised that much of that crucial aid would have been canceled. Now, here's what could happen if we failed to provide it. Without contraception reaching the women in the developing world, our ranks would expand by 1 million more humans, not every 4.5 days, but every 2.5 days. That's 7 more Beijings a year instead of 4. Put it another way, forget all those UN population projections, just a half a child more per woman, and we'll be nearing not 11, but 16 billion by the end of this century. Or, if we provide contraception for all, and I do discuss in here the promising new and far simpler male contraceptives that are coming ready. Anyhow, with contraception available to all, a half a child fewer per woman, we would be back down to 6 billion by the end of the century, well on our way to a sustainable future for our species, which each decade will be easier and not harder to feed. Now, does this sound far-fetched? Look, I fear it's a lot easier than coming up with zero-emission energy on a massive scale. We've all been trying to tap free sunlight and wind for years. Gloucester is doing its part, and we must keep trying. But we're still nowhere near capable of running all of our industries, our vehicles, cities, India's and China's on it. Nor do we know how to do something even more magical, convince everyone to consume less. I mean, there's no condom yet for consumption. We are all born into addiction to electricity. This, however, is technology we already have. It's nothing requiring some enormous technological leap. And combining contraception with education for females, we would be tapping one of the richest human resources of all. That same Viennese Demographic Institute that I mentioned earlier recently calculated that if female education were now universally available, there would be 1 billion fewer of us, not by the end, but by the middle of this century. And think of how all those educated women would help those feared labor shortages during a demographic transition back to sanity. Former World Bank economist Herman Daly has noted that to change the minds and hearts of economists, politicians, and voters in order to switch to a sustainable economy might seem impossible. But the alternative, he said, an ever-growing economy, is biophysically impossible. So in choosing between tackling a political impossibility or a biophysical impossibility, I judge the latter to be more impossible and take my chances with the former. What my research for Countdown has led me to conclude that we need to do in terms of family planning is even easier than that, because the majority of places and people on Earth are already doing it. More than half the countries in the world are at, near, or below replacement rate. Let's do whatever it takes to bring the rest there too. And then by making the means available so everybody can choose the numbers they want, come gradually down to a truly sustainable number, rather than ask how we're going to do the impossible, feed them all when we can't even feed the ones we have without messing up our planet even more. Now, I just want to read to you one little story from the book. And as I said, it responds to that question of, what about nature? How much do we need to ensure our own future here? For centuries, the cultural fabric of Iran has been woven by Persian carpet makers. And in a Turkish rug, each strand of yarn is knotted around 2 warp strands, but Persian rugs, it's 1 weft per warp, so they're twice as tight. The tightest still made today have 144 knots per square centimeter. And a rug like that of wool from the bellies of spring lambs can take 2 people 8 years to finish. In Tehran's Carpet Museum hang old masterpieces created for royal families with 160 knots per centimeter, woven by girls with sharp eyes and tiny fingers. One fabulously complex floral pattern that measures 320 square feet took 3 people working 10 hours a day, 18 years to complete. And the principal weaver was 17 when she started and 35 when it was finished. Now, As a biology student in the 1960s, Esmail Harom would stare at rugs in the museum, such as one completed in 1416 that depicts the Tree of Life, a Zoroastrian symbol that predates Islam. Among its branches, he recognized turkeys, bustards, vultures, mynas, owls, doves, thrushes, hoopoes, flamingos, swallows, quail, parrots, ostriches, and partridges. Around the trunk crawled bears, turtles, alligators, beetles, centipedes, lions, and leopards. The depictions were so detailed that zoologists could determine each species. He was looking, Koroma understood, at some creatures now extinct in his land. The eyes of ancient carpet weavers are how Iranian biologists today know what once lived there. Esmail Harom was the son of an Air Force pilot who, like his mother, was one of 12 children. As a boy, Korom's father would take him riding in Hoshyelag, a wildlife refuge whose name means good summer pasture. It's just south of the Caspian Sea. The grass there grew so tall that he would lose sight of the park ranger guide and have to stand on his horse's back to see where the stalks were moving to know which way to go. Hoshyelag was then home to the largest population of cheetahs in Iran, and the sight of those fleet creatures thrilled him, so he resolved to become a naturalist. After graduating from the University of Shiraz, he became a field ornithologist with the Department of the Environment, and he traveled to every ecosystem in Iran. Eventually, he was appointed director of the Bureau of Wildlife, and he began a weekly television program that introduced viewers to the natural wonders of their country. His TV documentaries made Esmail Harom Iran's best-known naturalist. He took viewers to places like Miankala, a 48-kilometer sandy peninsula that's the last stretch of natural shoreline along Iran's 800-kilometer Caspian Sea coast. In the early 17th century, Shah Abbas of Persia's Safavid dynasty once killed 90 leopards and 30 tigers there. In 1830, Nasser al-Din Shah of the Qajar dynasty, who had 85 wives, wrote that early one spring morning he watched millions of migrating birds darken the skies for 4 hours. 50 years later, one of his many sons would take a group of friends to Miankala. With newly invented high-powered rifles, they shot 6,000 pheasants, 150 deer, 63 buffaloes, 18 leopards, and 35 tigers. And that same prince later described an area outside Shiraz where hundreds of men hunted day and night. The mountain is so rich in wildlife, he wrote in his memoirs, that if the number of hunters were 10 times over, there would still be enough game for everybody. We stayed there for 2 months, and when we were leaving, the number of animals was still the same. Now, statements like these, Koroma told his audiences, prove that the Qajar hunters never set out to eradicate entire species of wild animals. In fact, they hoped to hunt forever. They considered natural resources, such as wildlife and forests, to be renewable resources that simply could not be exterminated by man. But all the species they prized are now rare or threatened or extinct. The mighty lion, the Caspian tiger, the Iranian wild ass, gazelles, bighorn mountain sheep, leopards, and the cheetah. Yes, the cheetah, he says. In his home near Tehran's Islamic Assad University, where he teaches, small Persian rugs cover the hardwood floors. The brick fireplace is flanked by paintings of migrating cranes and the endangered red-breasted goose that winters in Miankala. Above the mantel, a 19th century Tabriz tapestry declares in graceful Farsi calligraphy that God is the greatest protector of all. Now, whenever Koroma is confronted by someone demanding to know whether it really matters if cheetahs disappear from the face of the earth or if tigers go extinct, he tells them about one particular cheetah. It was where he least expected to encounter one. It was January 2003, and he was visiting America for the first time. A cousin in San Diego had married a school teacher who invited him to observe a 6th grade class. He was charmed that the teacher had brought an Iranian flag and Iranian coins to show the students. When she next unrolled an exquisite crimson rug, his eyes widened. That rug, he knew immediately, was a pure silk paisley pattern from the holy city of Qom, worth thousands. Our guest is an ecologist, she told her students. Ecology, she explained, is the science of how everything on Earth, people, plants, animals, fungi, microbes, rocks, soil, water, and air is connected. All over the world, there are people who protect animals and plants so those connections don't break. Dr. Koroma is one of them. There was a knock on the classroom door, and Koroma gasped with the sixth graders as another teacher entered, accompanied by a curator from the San Diego Zoo. The leash she held was attached to a muzzled cheetah. There are two populations of cheetahs, said the teacher, one in Africa, the other in Asia. The Asiatic cheetah today lives only in Iran. Koroma was amazed that this American woman knew something he wished his own people comprehended. What do you think would happen, she asked, if Asiatic cheetahs disappeared from the earth? Would it be a disaster? Would we be in trouble? Would you still be able to go to school? Would there still be gasoline for your father's car? Would we have electricity and water? Should we be concerned? The students agreed that this elegant creature, silent on its haunches before them, deserved to live. But none thought that their world would come crashing down along with the cheetahs in the event that it didn't. The teacher turned to the glowing silk rug draped on an easel. This beautiful Persian rug belongs to an Iranian who lives in San Diego. It's made with more than 1.5 million knots. It took women years to do that. Now suppose some boy with a pair of scissors cuts a few knots from its edge. What'll happen? Nothing. You wouldn't even notice it. Now suppose he returns and makes 200 knots disappear. Probably you still wouldn't notice it among the 1.5 million. But what if he keeps doing it? Soon you'll have a small hole. Then it'll get bigger, and eventually nothing will be left of this carpet. Extending her arms, she pointed at the foliage outside and at the cheetah that was watching her as raptly as her students and Koroma. All this is the carpet of life. You are sitting on it. Each of those knots represents one plant or animal. They and the air we breathe, the water we drink, and our groceries are not manufactured. They are produced by what we call nature. This rug represents that nature. And if something happens in Asia or Africa and a cheetah disappears, that's one knot from the carpet. And if you understand that, you realize that we are living on a very limited number of species and resources on which our lives depend. Thank you very much.
Never had nothing, no one to care. That's why I seem to have more than my share. I've got a man crazy for me. He's funny that way.